I was contemplating, 'cause I had this thing in my mind that I hope I have a good name. It was very important to me that the name that because I so far had liked everyone's name that I had met as initiated devotees, but I was worried that I would get a name that just didn't sound right, that wasn't me, but I knew that I had to accept it because it was obviously, because Prabhupada knew what my spiritual name was, so he was going to call me by that name. So it was just a struggle going on inside my, completely on a superficial platform. It had nothing to do with it was just distraction. My mind was just distracting me from. But I had some significance. I knew, so I dwelled on it as long as I needed to. And I was thinking, well, the name. I was attracted to a particular name. I thought, well, maybe I'll get that name. This is a good name. I like the sound of that name. And the name was Madan Mohan. Madan Mohan. I kept saying Madan Mohan. Boy, that's a good name. I hope I can get that name. Obviously, totally whimsical. So, a few days passed. The time for initiation came. In the meantime, I had gotten some ready-made beads, which I was actually these beads I had with me, and I had actually I had been using them because I had been in a temple for about 6 months in Montreal. So these were my beads. So I brought them with me to the yajna, to the initiation. And it was a beautiful scene, of course. I'd never witnessed so much grandeur and so much effortless grace, all in such a small, in a small space, and with such simple gestures. It was a wonderful experience. But so during this, Prabhupada would take the beads from somebody, then chant on them, then return them. When it came my turn, I hand him my beads. So he takes my beads, and they're not overly small. They were like the same size that most other beads were. But they were, on the small side. So I hand him the beads, and he takes them, and he looks at them with disapproval. He says, "You couldn't have gotten bigger beads?" And at that moment I'm thinking, beads, and I'm like, all of a sudden, I'm already being, I'm demolished. I have no land to stand on. I'm just like this. I didn't know what to say, so I'm quiet. I don't know. I think I shrugged, and he took the bead. He chanted, and while he was chanting, I'm thinking, Madan Mohan, Madan Mohan. And that's, the mind is just going on. I mean, it was like on hold, waiting. Finally, he begins chanting. He hands me the beads. And before I take them, he says, "Is there already someone named Madan Mohan?" And then all the devotees are going, "Oh, yes, Prabhupada. Here he is." And then with that, there's not a split second even. "Your name is Baradraj." Chant, 16. My marriage was opposed by my parents. They were horrified at the idea that I was going to marry the movement. They refused to come to attend. And my mother had sent a telegram to Prabhupada that I had a history of mental illness. Totally untrue. Or maybe true, but not to my knowledge. That she was very angry and wrote a very angry letter to Prabhupada saying, a telegram actually, it was just the day before marriage, that this was, that I didn't see the telegram, but I heard about it. Prabhupada called me in. This is my second interview with Prabhupada. Called me in, and right away he said, "I received a telegram from your mother. She says you are crazy. Is this true?" I thought about it and I thought, no. I said, "I don't think so, Srila Prabhupada. But I suspect that she might be." Which was not a proper thing to say about one's mother in front of Prabhupada. Prabhupada never tolerated, generally did not tolerate disrespect to one's parents. There are other stories, but they're not my stories, so I mean, but I know there's a story about Brahmananda where he was made to bow down to his mother in front of Prabhupada, which is an interesting story, and there were others. But I had shown that kind of independence in front of Prabhupada. I wanted him to know that my mind was set, that, that actually this whole process was a way of, of cutting the bonds of, the family, the worldly family influence that might be there to stop me from doing that which I know I should wholeheartedly do, being guided by his wisdom and his kindness. So I said, but I think she might be. And I actually, believed it. He laughed. Very, just a very hearty, heartfelt laughter. He said, ha, ha, ha. He said, well, that's all right. He said, if anyone asks, he said, I have not received this telegram. So Prabhupada had asked me to create some sample. He didn't say sample, he said, can you draw a picture of Lord Chaitanya? Obviously he wanted to see. So a few days later, after the marriage, and my wife, Rukmini, had brought in her paintings, and other paintings were there, Dharani's paintings, and Prabhupada would look at everything. And I did this drawing of Lord Chaitanya, which was not, in retrospect, it was, it was such a struggle. Of course I did it in, in an afternoon or whatever. I had some time and I devoted some time to it. But I thought, well, it was not finished. The figure of Lord Chaitanya was there, but everything else was just barely sketched in. But I had put in, everything I had into Lord Chaitanya's face and his expression and his attitude, whatever I understood to be right, to be put into the picture. And Prabhupada looked at other pieces of art, and mine was rolled up on the desk in front of him. And he looked at Rukmini's painting, and he appreciated, and he said, that's nice. Or I don't know if he said anything at all, he was appreciating it. And then he noticed that there was this rolled up paper in front of him on the desk. And he said, what is this? And someone said, it's a drawing by Baradraj. And Prabhupada took it and he unrolled it. And as he was unrolling it from the top, I could see that he was looking at the first thing he saw was Lord Chaitanya's face. And as soon as he got to it, his eyes got big, really big. And Prabhupada's eyes were big to start with, but whenever he got excited about something, and they'd like really, really expand. And then he unrolled some more, and then he got to the rest, and then finally, when he unrolled the whole picture, he had the biggest grin on his face. His face was just expanding, and his teeth were just showing. It was like his whole face it became like a sun, It was like he was shooting these rays. And he was looking at it and said, he said, the husband is better. The first exhibit was completed miraculously, and it was that year when all the devotees, the first time devotees came out in droves for the Gauranga festival, and it was a wonderful year, and Prabhupada came, and lo and behold, we actually completed an exhibit which was arranged in a kind of a horseshoe in front of the incomplete Mayapur temple at the time. So everything was like that, shacks, the exhibits were made in these bamboo shacks, and everything was like just barely kept together with some cow dung and arrowroot and twine. And but I thought, to this day, I think those are the most wonderful exhibits that we had created. There was such vibrant, raw energy, real wonderful. And so we started. At one end, we actually started somehow. I wasn't there. I missed the beginning. I was, preparing something and getting things ready, and the tour, Prabhupada's tour, had started. It was his first time of seeing the exhibit, and all these devotees were there. So I'm running, to try to catch up, and so they started it backwards, started at the wrong end, and going backwards from the end to the beginning. The beginning exhibit was my work, and one of the end exhibits was Rukmini's work. Not the end exhibit, but one of the last ones. And after the first or last exhibit, Prabhupada moved on, and he came to the exhibit that Rukmini had done, which was wonderful. It showed it was an exhibit of Lord Chaitanya in fainting ecstasy in front of the Jagannath Murti, Jagannath, Subhadra, and Balaram. And Lord Chaitanya was like a stick in his transcendental, ecstatic condition. And Prabhupada looked at it, and you could tell he was drinking the nectar and that he was affected by it very much. And he said, "Who has made this?" And by that time I had caught up, with the procession, and I said, "Rukmini, my wife, has made this." Prabhupada said, "Very, very good." So then slowly moved on to the next thing, came around, and finally came to the last exhibit, which is my exhibit. And it was an exhibit of Prahlad, of Nrsingadev tearing Hiranyakashipu, and Prahlad standing there and offering him prayers. I think a picture of that exhibit actually made it into the songbook, one of the early publications. And Prabhupada looked at it and said, "Well, who has made this?" I said, "This is my work, Srila Prabhupada." He said, "You still have some learning to do." He said, "This is not yet perfect. The wife is better, I think." He said, "An artist worships Krishna by his intelligence." So just sitting and thinking of Krishna intelligently, making decisions how to portray Krishna, that is engaging one's intelligence in worship. And by doing so, then Krishna reveals himself. As Prabhupada was talking about qualifications, a man's qualifications, and how hard it is to judge, and that it is almost a gift to judge another man's qualities. It isn't a matter of just comparing one man to another, or going by some standard of socioeconomic worth. And he said my grandmother was expert at this. He said she was a simple woman, not educated, and but everyone respected her opinions. He said, I'm trying to remember whether it was his sister, I think it might have been his sister, who, there were a number of boys who were applying for the honor of her hand. But it had to go through the grandmother. She was the one who decided who was worthy, who was not worthy. So, so this young man was there, and he was well educated, and she was like drilling him, He was educated and came from a good family. He had, there was money, and he was just, a gem of a person, upstanding, and so on. And then she said, "Can you ride a bicycle?" He said, "Oh no, I never learned." And he was a young man in his, I guess, early 20s. She said, so she didn't say anything. there was one of the questions she asked him. And afterwards, so they came and said, well, what do you think? She said, he's worthless. And everyone was in shock, She said, he has no drive. He said, any boy, any young boy has an opportunity to learn to ride a bicycle, he will get on, even if it's not his own, some friends, he will get on and try to learn. Who has any kind of drive? I said, he has no drive, he's worthless. So, we went on, many things were discussed, and, here I'm living with a head full of ideas and charged with a dozen of projects, and I just arrived, I'm totally overwhelmed. I walked out, and, the first person I saw is like almost the first person I knew from America that I hadn't seen for a long time, and it was Devananda, who was at that time already initiated as a sannyasi, Devananda Swami. And, how are you, and we were like, hugging each other and obeisances and trying to catch. It was like I was there standing on the steps for about, I don't know, a minute maybe. He just started to talk. And all of a sudden, Satsrupa, who was Prabhupada's personal attendant at the time, comes running out. And he's like, coming towards me with this sense of alarm. He says, Baradraj, please come right away. Prabhupada wants to, there's something he needs to tell you. Please come back. So I'm saying, okay, Devananda, excuse me, I have to go. Prabhupada's calling me. We'll talk later. And I was, literally, maybe a minute and a half I was there. And I'm running back into Prabhupada's quarters. And, which were at the end of this long walkway. And, I'm running in, and, I come into the room, I pay my obeisances. And I look up, and Prabhupada is looking at me very sternly. And he says, so, we have discussed so many things. You have so many things to do. I don't think you have any time to stand around and talk. Said Aravinda his disciples were so enamored of his greatness that they were like fog. They didn't know what to do. He said when he passed away, when he died, they didn't know what to do with him. They thought he was in samadhi. And so they left him to sit there. He said, until he began to smell. He said, so he did not have intelligent disciples. He said his disciples didn't know the difference between the living man and the dead man. He said, what is the use of a disciple like that? He said, less intelligent. He said, you should never criticize you cannot criticize, he said, the other teachers. He said, you do not know, it is not your position. He said, but it's okay for you to criticize their disciples. You can tell them they're less intelligent. Muruladhara was in that same predicament, in that enigma. What do I know about Krishna? How do I paint Krishna? This struggle, the eternal thing, and what's my qualification, and how is it possible, and what is, how can I look at what I'm doing as a divine representation, and if I can't, what would it be to somebody else? And so he asked, sitting with Prabhupada in the room, and it was one of those rare times. I think it was in San Francisco, actually. And Muruladhara was just starting he was a newcomer and was just starting to paint. Same thing, Prabhupada charged him with, with work. And so he wanted to know, so he was sitting around, and Prabhupada looked, and there were many different pictures of Krishna, and posters and calendar pictures and little things in Prabhupada's desk. And so Muruladhara was bewildered. He said, well, which one and they were different. So he asked Prabhupada, he said, We have so many pictures of Krishna here, but they're all different. So, which one is most like? Can you direct me? Can you tell me which one of these is most like Krishna? And he said, and Prabhupada looked at him as though he was totally crazy. He said, I have never, he said, I have never received such a clear message from anyone that I'm out of my head. He Prabhupada looked at him and he said, they're all Krishna. They're all Krishna. Each one of these is exactly like Krishna. One time in Vrindavan, he was recovering after a long illness. Apparently, began to take his morning walks again, and the devotees were overjoyed to, turned out in great numbers to walk with him. And then Prabhupada was feeling very inspired these walks. But he would come back from his morning walk. He was practically exhausted. He'd be laying there for the rest of the day. But on the morning walk, he was energetic. He would talk and be very animated and argue it, be very strong. And so I remember one morning he said, how is this? He said, I can walk, and when I'm walking, I have the strength, and here we are talking and walking, and I'm feeling strong. But when I get back, I'm not. He was just thinking out loud. He said, I have no strength. I cannot move almost. So, what is that? And as the other devotees became very thoughtful with him, so, what is that? How is that? And Brahmananda said, it's transcendental. Srila Prabhupada. And Prabhupada looked at him for a moment and said, yes. After finding out that I spoke another language, he said, he talked about the creative service, the artistic services, and he said, so this is this you can do, no matter what language you speak. These images, just to paint Krishna. He said it. This speaks to anyone, anywhere in the world. It brings Krishna directly into their heart and into their mind. He says, this is not unimportant. This is great service. You should be convinced of this. So, the artists were beginning to feel more easy about, the pressure that was on him to stop painting and go out and distribute books, because there was that anxiety, but not being good enough. These people, they can only just sit there and paint, second-rate citizens. But Prabhupada said, no, he said, this is actually very important. So sometimes you can think of it as an even more important service, because it is not restricted. You have to translate into so many languages, and maybe a good translation, maybe not. But this, he said, this is direct preaching. He said. There was a devotee, whose name at that time was Patitudharan, tall and lanky and very individual, much of an individual. He danced in his own way. He talked in his own way. He in short, he was unconventional in many ways. So he obviously didn't fit into that narrow category of, book distributor. So he obviously going on in his own mind with some dilemma. So he said, after a nice big kirtan in temple, Prabhupada gave a lecture, and then all of a sudden he said, are there any questions? So he comes out of the blue, he said, Srila Prabhupada, we're all here, he said, I'm paraphrasing, he said, we're all here eager to hear what will please you. We want to do what is most pleasing to you. We've heard so many, there's so many different types of service is dear to you, and some, as you have said, is more dear. Will you tell us clearly what is most dear to you? And Prabhupada said, just chant Hare Krishna and become simply wonderful. Eat simply wonderfuls and become simply wonderful. That is all. Hare Krishna. And this was in the last few days of his life, actually. Unknown to me, of course. I kept thinking that Prabhupada was going to blow us away by just all of a sudden, one day just saying, okay, it's, okay, enough of that, I'm back to full life. So he, that particular morning, I started. Oh, it was he had stopped my harmonium playing the day before, so I was shy. I didn't know whether I should play it again, because I didn't know why it had stopped me. Just thought maybe that the sound itself was somehow annoying, irritating. So then I would just chant without harmonium. But then on that particular morning, I ventured one more time to try to play the harmonium. But this time I played a tune that I hadn't played, that I hadn't heard for a long time. I hadn't played for a long time, but it was one of the first sort of unusual tunes that Prabhupada had recorded. It was recorded a long time ago, somewhere either in Boston or New York or someplace. And it was this Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Very unusual and soulful, and it's not, can't place it in any particular cult. It was just spontaneous, something that was just Prabhupada's own unusual sound, where it was coming from his heart somewhere. And so that morning I began by playing that tune. I don't recall Prabhupada stirring at all. I mean, there were days when he was just completely motionless. Couldn't even tell that he was awake or asleep or what. Just motionless. And he had been fasting for months now, months. I mean, just living on little water and pomegranate juice, occasional something, but really fasting. And but yet every day he would set aside some time for dictation. Even if he couldn't sit up, they would hold the microphone, to his mouth, and Prabhupada would continue dictating the translations and purports of Srimad Bhagavatam. Kept on going. But that morning, he was motionless. It was early morning hours, and suddenly I noticed, I looked up, I noticed he had motioned to one of his attendants. I think it was Nanda Kumar at the time. So Nanda Kumar or Shrutakirti. They asked him, or maybe it was Giriraj. They took turns to ask, and he wanted to sit up. He sat up. And as I was chanting it, he began clapping his hands like this. It was like it was slow motion, but it was very definite, right on beat. And he would nod his head in approval. It was such a reward, such a wonderful thing, you know, and that he, hearing that, it was like, it's hard to say, it was like, I don't know, it was the best reward I could have asked for. So that tune, is, you know, has a very, very special weight, you know, for me.
Je anilo premadana koruna prachu